Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show with today's intro. Our guest is Neal Baer, who is a very, very notable showrunner. It's an executive producer of TV shows, and he's been doing this for a long time. So before he became an executive producer for TV shows, Neal became a Harvard-trained doctor. Yes, he went to Harvard Medical School. And I guess for whatever reason, that wasn't his path, if you can believe that. So he grew up with another very notable showrunner, and those guys were friends. And he's like, hey, come help me out with China Beach. I kind of need a doctor's voice, and you got nothing else to do. So he went and started working on China Beach, and slowly but surely, all of a sudden, this career happens. So China Beach leads to ER, which is mind-blowing. And there's a series of fantastic hit show after hit show. So Neal comes on today to talk about his career a little bit, but also the latest show that they do with Keifer Sutherland. It's called Designated Survivor, and you can watch that on Netflix. If you go there, you'll get a chance to see one of the storylines is a pandemic that causes all kinds of chaos, and Keifer ends up becoming president of the United States in his character. So we talk about the origins of the COVID virus and all of the different things that he does as a doctor in terms of storytelling, and how, hey, look at this, life, stranger than fiction. It actually, ends up that their show is timely because of the COVID outbreak pandemic, but also just the tension that it creates with these kind of stories in real life, and then how close they were to predicting everything. I think you'll really enjoy what Neal has to say. It was a blast talking to him, and I can't wait to have him on again to talk more in depth about his career and how he actually does those things. So a couple real quick things. One, the show is doing great. You guys are supporting it. We just had a really big month in April. Thank you so much for listening. If you're on YouTube listening, awesome. We're about to hit a big milestone for subscribers. So if you like YouTube, we're doing more video on there now, doing the full transition over to video. It continues to grow and evolve, and as soon as we're able, I think we're going to try to do mobile video shows as well. So we'll see just how that goes. Anyhow, the thing I wanted to say about that was thank you so much, all of you, for your support. It means a lot to us, for John, Scott, and I, as we put these things together. And we have so many great shows. We've got shows recorded all the way out until June now at this point. So we're still well over a month ahead and just getting great guests all the time. Thank you so much for that. And finally, look, it's a tough time for people. And so obviously, we could use your support with Save the Brave. Go to savethebrave.org, click on the donate tab, and find a little bit amount of money each month. Put that in there, and that'll help out a lot. The other thing I want to say is, if not that, give charity as a gift. Lead with charity as your gift. Go to CharityOnTop.org. Buy someone a charity gift card. It's real simple. You just like any other kind of gift card. You say, hey, I want to give this person charity. So you spend the $10, $25, $50, whatever that amount of money is, you spend it. Here's the cool part. You can also elect to cover all of the fees, which are nominal, but to make sure that that whole amount of money goes directly to that charity. And let me tell you something, on the other end of it, it comes out of the blue, and they're like, oh my God, here's $50. All they've got to do is just put the money in their account. It's all electronic, super easy. It's a fantastic way to give. CharityOnTop.org. Go there and give that way, and you'll be doing someone a big favor. All right, long intro. Sorry about that, but I really wanted to encourage people to think of charity as a gift and a way to lead with that. All right, here comes Neal Baer.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hello, it's Neal Baer, and we're listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Was connected with Neal Baer because I'm connected with Nam, oddly enough. And so Sean said, hey, you should talk to Neal. And she was absolutely right. So I wanted to bring you on for a couple of reasons. One, as a showrunner, obviously you've got a lot to say in terms of TV and Hollywood and that kind of things. But also, you're a physician, and you just recently produced an edited volume of academic papers. So let's dive into who the heck you are and what the heck you do, and how did you get to be so smart, and how do you get it all done? You're so busy.
Well, I'm very, very fortunate. I started out as a graduate student in sociology at Harvard and didn't really feel it was my niche. And I fell by chance into a documentary filmmaking course, and that changed my life. It was taught by a guy who's since deceased named Ed Pincus, who's the father of cinema verite. And I learned filmmaking from him and ended up producing his last documentary as a way of gratitude to what he gave me, changing the course of my life. So I went from graduate school to the American Film Institute as a directing fellow and started directing and writing, if you remember the old after school specials.
Yes.
So I did an ABC after school special called Private Affairs about a girl who sees her father having an affair. And that then went on to China Beach. And then kind of got nervous. Could I make it in Hollywood? And I left with my year-old son and wife and went to Harvard Medical School. And I was planning on being a pediatrician in Boston when I got a call from John Wells, my childhood friend. We literally grew up 6 blocks from each other in Denver, Colorado, and went to Holly Hills Elementary School together, Cherry Creek High School together. People say, how do you get into Hollywood and show business and become a TV writer? And I say, grow up with John Wells, because John produced China Beach, ER, West Wing, Shameless. So I never had to write a spec script or do what most people do. He knew I had done an after school special, and he invited me in to do a freelance episode of China Beach, and that's how I got started. So he wrote to me when I was a 4th year medical student at Harvard and said that he was producing a show called ER, and that Michael Crichton had written the script around 1969 when he was a medical student at Harvard. And I read it and I thought it was amazing because it was from the perspective of the doctors and the medical students. It was outdated, so I gave him some background on updating it because it was 25 years old. It was, the lore has it that it was found in a trunk in Spielberg's office. And Spielberg was going to direct it as a film, but then decided it would make a good TV series. And NBC didn't like it. They thought it had too many storylines, but they felt that the auspices were too important to turn down. Michael Crichton had done Jurassic Park, and Steven had done Schindler's List by that point and all the other movies before that. So they made it, and it just took off like no show since. Year 2, we had 48 million viewers for one episode. So when Game of Thrones is announcing 19 million viewers for I'm like, okay, well, that's
you're
cool.
adorable, Game of Thrones.
But we had more than 2 times that. So, or 2 times that, actually, or more than 2 times that. I came back from medical school to LA to do ER and I stayed there for 7 years and went up the ranks from staff writer to executive producer, showrunner, and then left at year 7. I'd worked with Mariska Hargitay on ER, and SVU was in trouble. It was year 2, and they'd already had 2 showrunners. So I came, and Dick Wolf said, we don't have a script. We have to shoot Monday. This was Friday the 13th, 2000. Never forget. And he said, so I'm going to toss you in the pool and see if you sink or swim. So I had to write a script over a weekend, and it turned out to be a show with Kate Mara called Pixies, and stayed on the show as the showrunner for 11 years, which was wonderful to do all the stories that we told, from opening the backlog of rape kits to HIV deniers to the first show about transgender children. We just were able to, gun violence, we were able to really plumb the depths and really go forward with the show in terms of places people hadn't gone before.
Well, before you go past that, let me just thank you for doing that, because like you guys are sort of the Norman Lear of that generation. You guys explored things that were unexplorable and gave it to us in a way that was consumable. And if you don't do that, then,
Yeah.
who's gonna? So seriously, thank you for doing that, taking on that risk. Because on a show that's failing, you come in and go, let's really do extra hard shit, and I admire
we
that.
did. It was fun, and I was allowed to, and NBC was super supportive, and Mariska and Maloney and Ice-T and Belzer dug in and loved it. And so I loved doing it for 11 years, and I left. I thought, well, this is enough. And I went to do a show called A Gifted Man with Patrick Wilson, another medical series. And then I did Under the Dome with Stephen King and Steven Spielberg again, was reunited with him, and I did that show, ran for 3 years, which was really fun. And that's kind of like where we are now. We're under the dome. So, but the dome is, we can move, but we're still under this COVID-19 dome.
Yeah.
We can't see it. And we're running out of supplies, just like we did under the dome. And then I went and did a show recently. ABC canceled Designated Survivor, and I was asked to run it for Netflix. And I said yes, because I'd never worked with Keifer and I wanted to. And also, I love the platform of being able to tell really intense stories of a president who was up for re-election, who was a designated survivor. And we're hearing lots about that now in the UK and everywhere. And I was also able to bring Tony Edwards on, whom I worked with on ER, which was so great to work with him again. So, because it is like a family when you're working with people for 7 years, you get to know them so well. And I called him and I said, would you play Keifer's chief of staff? And he said yes. And then Julie White, who won a Tony, was nominated last year for a Tony Award. I'd worked with her on SVU and thought she'd be perfect, and she said yes. And then we brought on new actors, and it was really gratifying to do it. And I was kind of bummed because it didn't get the attention that I hoped it would get. But now when I go on Twitter, I see this cascade of tweets about Designated Survivor and the pandemic, because we did a pandemic storyline through the whole 3rd season with Maggie Q's character. And she's trying to figure out why first birds are dying, cardinals, and then people are getting the flu, and then they're getting something worse, and what's going on. And it turns out that some right-wing fanatics who are really sort of white supremacists are using CRISPR to control the population. So we got into all that before people were talking about CRISPR. The reason they started talking a lot about CRISPR was about a year ago, Dr. He in China used CRISPR, which is a technique, if you think of it like scissors and glue, where you can cut out a mutated gene in your genome and glue in one that's not affected. He did that with an embryo that became twins, and he mutated a gene that prevents someone from acquiring HIV. And we already knew that there were a small number of people in the population who were exposed to HIV and didn't become infected because they had receptors that were mutated. And so he did that, and that created a huge uproar amongst scientists and the public around the world. But that's where, and I'd been interested in that issue for a long time about using CRISPR. And what's so fascinating about CRISPR is it's already been used in the United States to treat a woman with sickle cell disease, which is a terrible disease that causes not only constant, intense pain and suffering, but also can cause strokes. And essentially what happens is your red blood cells are sickled. They're not shaped in a way that easily go through one's arteries and veins. And so they get clogged, and it can cause strokes and horrible pain and organ dysfunction. And so geneticists have CRISPR'd this woman's DNA. What they did is they took out her bone marrow, because it's her bone marrow that's making the diseased cells, and they gave her what we call a bone marrow ablation. So they killed all of her bone marrow. But instead of giving her a transplant, which puts her at high risk for rejection, and you have to be on anti-rejection medication because you won't be a perfect match unless you have a twin, they took her own cells and they used CRISPR, the cut and paste. They turned on a gene that causes the production of what's called fetal hemoglobin. We're all born with fetal hemoglobin, which gloms onto oxygen better than our normal hemoglobin, but it turns off genetically because we don't need it. We need it in utero because obviously we're not breathing air.
Right.
We're getting oxygen through our mother's blood. So they turned this on in her, and to date, she's been transfusion-free, pain-free, doing well. And so this is just next to miraculous, and can be really wonderful for treating all kinds of genetic diseases like sickle cell and beta thalassemia and cystic fibrosis and all these things that are caused by a gene we actually know exactly where it is and on what chromosome it's on. So with that good, with CRISPR, comes the other side of it, which is the dual, which is could be used to make a virus more transmissible. It could be used, this is where we get into the COVID discussion. It can be used to combine destructive parts of viruses. It's conceivable someone could make an Ebola pox. We already did make, without using CRISPR, a more transmissible H5N1 flu. And there was a big debate in the Obama administration about whether to release the genomic structure of that. And it finally was. And the researchers in Canada and the Netherlands who did it said they did it so that we'd be prepared for something like this, where we'd have a pandemic of a very transmissible, lethal flu. Because fortunately, bird flu wasn't very transmissible. It's very lethal, much more so than COVID, but it's hard to get. You have to live with birds. So there were things made with DNA sequences, like somebody took pieces of DNA and put it together. They made polio at SUNY Stony Brook some years ago, and somebody made horsepox, which is related to smallpox, in Canada. With CRISPR, it would be much easier to do it. And not only that, but I think of this profound paradigm shift where we talk about mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons. And it's like, we'll blow you off the map if you blow us off the map. And so we don't do anything.
Right.
And you need a nation state to afford it. You can't walk around with a briefcase of plutonium. So it's only nation states that can afford the infrastructure and the massive amount of money it takes to build nuclear reactors and do these things. All bets are off now with CRISPR because you need a DNA sequencer that could cost $2,500, and you need access to DNA sequences. And if you are fairly good at basic lab technique, you can CRISPR a virus conceivably, and you can go online and buy CRISPR kits, which I think is pretty crazy. And you can buy a kit online and make green tree frogs bigger using CRISPR and affecting their gene. And you can make fluorescent yeast for your beer. And so this is all fun and games and science at home, but there's really a very, very dark, dire side to this. So that's a long explanation, but that's where my show came from, because of my concern about CRISPR. It has the potential to do great good and unimaginable harm, and it can change the human genome. So maybe I should explain very briefly for the listeners 2 points that are really important when we're thinking about CRISPR that people often don't hear about. There are 2 approaches using CRISPR. One is what's called somatic cells, and the other is called germ cells. So if somebody conceivably, let's say, has cystic fibrosis, a genetic disease, we could conceivably, we haven't done it, and we have done it for, as I said, sickle cell disease. We go in and we change their cells. So we changed this woman's blood cells, and we re-engrafted her bone. I didn't, but they did, her bone marrow. So she wasn't going to have any problem with rejection. It's her own bone marrow, but it was CRISPR'd. So that's called somatic. If she were to have children, she would still pass on the sickle cell gene, because the CRISPR was only affecting the cells that make the hemoglobin.
Gotcha. Makes
Now,
sense.
Germ cell is where we take reproductive cells, or we take a very, very early embryo. And that's what Dr. He did in China. He took an embryo and he went in and mutated a gene in the embryo for the HIV receptor. So those children will pass on that mutated gene to any children they have. So that's where we start to get into some real issues. So there's, first of all, the viral, making viruses and bacteria, and then there's the human evolution question. Because if we change someone's germ cells, their sperm cell or their egg cell, so that they pass on this trait to their offspring, then we are conceivably changing human evolution. And that's where we get into a lot of questions about human enhancement, because people could conceivably go to a geneticist and say they want a taller child or a more muscular child. Now it's more complex than treating cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease in the sense that we know exactly where it lies on the DNA, on the gene. But height and eye color and things like that are more complex and involve a number of different genes. But it's not inconceivable that we could locate some genes for height or musculature or things like that and enhance people if they could pay for it. So you can just imagine going down that road, designer babies. And yes, we could do designer babies now. That's inflammatory and it scares people, but we can certainly design children not to have genetic diseases. Now, some people say we don't need CRISPR because we have something called PGD, pre-implant genetic implantation, or where we look at embryos and we know like the couple has a genetic disease like Marfan's or cystic fibrosis, and we only would implant pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. We would only implant the eggs that have no genetic problems. And some people feel that that's that's going against, maybe some anti-choice people would say, you shouldn't be choosing which eggs to put in, but if you have the ability to screen for these very serious, not only life-threatening, but very painful diseases, should you do it? So we just get into the very basic realm of what does it mean to be human and how do we think about these things? And that's what I love doing on my shows. And that's why I did it on Designated Survivor, because I wanted to get into those questions and I wanted to have some solutions. The major solution, or at least an approach to dealing with these problems, would be to pass legislation that makes it very difficult to get certain kinds of DNA strands. Because we know we can check if somebody's ordering, CG, GG, CTT DNA strand, and we know that that's a piece of smallpox, we shouldn't be selling it to them.
Right.
And we have these companies that are supposed to screen and do these things, but they're not legally mandated to do it. So we need to have some legal mandates, especially now. Maybe COVID will help us in that arena, that we see just a virus that we knew about presumably since 2017. There was a big study for many years in caves in China, and they looked at these horseshoe bats and they saw various viruses that they were carrying. And one of them that they discovered in 2017 is very close genetically to the one that's making its way around the world. And you see that with transportation. New York Times did a great piece where you can kind of track Wuhan and then people going to Sydney, Australia, New York City, Seattle, Los Angeles, Tokyo, Indonesia, Singapore. Whoa, didn't take very much time for it to
Yeah, exactly. And it's terrifying.
Yeah, so that's sort of so those interests in science and being able to cure, but also do tremendous damage is what interests me. And I want to tell stories about it because I think it's incumbent on all of us as citizens to be aware of CRISPR and its potential and its downside, so that we can not just have people make decisions for us about it.
So when you, as a storyteller, when you're putting all this together, what does your storyteller brain tell your doctor brain in terms of, look, I don't trust China at all, to be honest. To be fair, I don't trust us either, but I really don't trust China, to be honest. If they had their Chernobyl moment with this, would they be honest? So as you tell these stories, and the reason why I asked this, my friend Kat Connor writes, she writes crime novels, right? And she looks at a lot of these things, and she immediately said, this got out because China made it and they lost control of it and they'll never admit to it. What do you think about these kind of theories? And China gives us no reason to believe them. So let's just say that up front.
Well, it worries me because, I don't think it's true because we have data that shows that this existed in a cave. So it didn't get made in China. So I think we have evidence about that. And I think we have to be really careful about conspiracies because the reality is much worse with CRISPR and what the potential is. As I said, now we can have rogue scientists and biohackers making all kinds of stuff that, we can't control.
Right.
We have to instate controls. So this whole conspiracy thing, I think we are drawn to uncertainty, and we love the spy thriller aspect. I think there's a part of COVID-19 that keeps us on the edge of our seats, and we don't know the ending. So I want to make a point about it. So every day, 1,200 children die in the world from malaria. And there's no panic about malaria.
Right.
Every day,
Yeah.
every
Right.
day, 1,200. So that's hundreds of thousands of kids a year. We know how to treat it. We know what causes it, the Anopheles mosquito. And we know how to prevent it, though we don't do a great job. And it doesn't affect people in the United States, so it's less of concern here. So why do we not panic about something that's killing many, many more people? And the answer is, we don't have uncertainty about it. We know what causes malaria. We know the outcome. We know how to treat it. There's nothing in the scenario or the narrative that we don't understand. We're still looking for ways to treat it better. We're still looking for ways to do things. And as an aside, I'll come back to it. There is something we can do that with CRISPR that's pretty interesting. So with COVID, we don't know how to treat it. We don't have any antivirals for it. We don't know what really caused it, though we think it's horseshoe bats being exposed to pangolins. That's sort of what's thought now in the wet marketplace, which is where SARS started, because bats and civets were exposed to each other in the marketplace. And we know that bats were exposed to camels for MERS. And there's another virus that appeared in Australia and caused terrible bleeding in horses and didn't get much attention. I think it's called HENDA. And 3 people died of that, and some people who worked with the horses. They had to really be exposed to it. It's kind of like the bird flu. They were like really trying to reach down into the throats of the horses and stuff. So they got exposed and they died. But that was it. And they figured out, they did a great study where they looked at everything around the horses, and they captured bugs, lizards, animals, birds, everything. And they looked to see what the vector was. And they noticed that these horses were, many of them that caught this virus were brood mares, and that they were in the hot sun in Australia and they wandered under fig trees. It's an amazing story. The narrative is an amazing story. And they wandered under fig trees, and they noticed that the horses were eating the figs. And they also noticed that there were bats, fruit bats in these trees, and they were eating the fruit. And of course, they would drop fruit and their saliva would be on the figs. And they would also defecate on the ground. And so these mares were eating grass exposed to the virus, and they were eating the figs. So they were a reservoir for the bat transmission from bats to horses to people. We were able to contain it, didn't get much attention. But this is happening a lot, and this has happened now with the 4 viruses I just told you about: SARS, MERS, HENDA, and COVID. So we knew about these things, and so I think doing all of these conspiracies is really not only unhelpful, but probably harmful, because you just have to look at the data. And there is a great paper on this that looked at these bats, and they saw all of these different viruses from 2005, I believe. It was published in 2017. So this virus wasn't just made in a lab. Now, that's not to say that in the future, and maybe because of CRISPR, it's promoting that theory, because that's not to say that we can't tinker with viruses and make them more transmissible or more virulent now using CRISPR technology.
Yeah. So the storyteller in you doesn't have to oblige the doctor in you, who's like, hey, let's all calm down about this. This came from fig trees or whatever. Like it's like the standard. Look, so I'm an espionage guy. I was a spy in the army, and it's always like the senior placed mole in the CIA that does it, and it gets to be a little tropey, but it is an effective story.
But look at what they did with the fig trees. They just used observation, and they figured it out. They first thought, is this a bug? Is this a mammal? What is going on? How is this happening? And then they used their observational.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm not saying that.
But I'm saying that that's how things really, really are understood, is through careful observation,
right?
And not jumping to conclusions. But as a writer, to answer that question, then I want to talk about mosquitoes. Medicine and health provide so many conundrums. Like I just said, CRISPR in and of itself provides this conundrum. It has the potential to treat and cure horrible diseases, no question. It also has the potential to create horrible viruses and bacteria. So it is a double-edged sword. And so you can imagine, and then it also, another offshoot of it is it could change human evolution in many ways. So that just raises a plethora of questions that the storyteller in me is just like, yes.
Yeah.
How do we talk about this? And how do we do a show about that? And all of this. So I'm always thinking, like when I did ER, I did a show for Clooney in year 3 that he got nominated for a second Emmy for. And he was saving a kid with cystic fibrosis who wanted to be allowed to die. Back then, you know, we still don't have great treatment. We have better treatment. Kids live longer, but it's a very painful, awful disease. Many multiple hospitalizations. And now the possibility of treating it with CRISPR. So the kid wanted to be allowed to make his own decision. He was 16 to die. And Clooney was struck with, should he let the kid die or should he save him? Because he could save him, but you know, ultimately the kid wasn't savable. And what age should you be allowed to make that decision? And he decides finally, Laura Innes's character says, is this about you or the kid? So that was a big turning point for Clooney. And he says, I'm going to do what you want. And you're mature enough. And then the mother, when the kid is dying, screams at Clooney to intubate the kid. And he's forced to do it because the kid is a minor.
Right.
So the point is that story about a kid who wants to be allowed to make his own decisions. And now it's easier for kids to do it since then, since 1996 when I did that show. Still difficult. It raises all kinds of personal questions. It shows what we're made of as human beings. When he's confronted with this, is this about his own hubris, about being a great doctor, or is it about doing what's best for the patient?
Yeah.
So there's always a story embedded that reveals character in the work that I try to do on ER SVU or Under the Dome or Designated Survivor. So let me go back because this is a really interesting question. When I said about 1,200 kids die a day from malaria, CRISPR provides us a way of potentially getting rid of the Anopheles mosquito, which is what carries malaria and causes terrible, terrible pain, suffering, demise for children and adults around the world. And there's a geneticist at MIT who developed what's called a gene drive. And that uses CRISPR. And what it does is it pinpoints in the mosquito, for instance, a way to make the mosquito infertile. But animals, for the most part, it's different with like some lower level, like worms and things, but they inherit genes from the chromosomes from half from their father and half from their mother. And this is what causes evolution because we keep resorting through meiosis. That's why we don't look completely like our siblings somewhat, because we might be, each of our parents has a possibility of sending us one or the other gene from their mother or their father. That's why we're related to our grandparents. That's why
Plus,
we're
don't forget the milkman.
Exactly. Well, that's another story I can tell you. So we can put a CRISPR gene in to mosquitoes so that they are infertile, but they would only have one gene, so they would pass the one gene on, but they would have a 50-50 chance they could pass on the one that's not infertile. But a gene drive copies it essentially, Xeroxes it, and makes both genes that way. So we can make these mosquitoes pass on to their offspring infertility. And ultimately, guess what? We would make Anopheles mosquitoes extinct. And this has been talked about for listeners who are interested. They can read a New Yorker piece from several years back about an experiment that was talked about on Nantucket to stop Lyme disease. And we know that Lyme disease is caused by a bacteria, not a virus, but a bacteria that infects these mice, these deer mice. And ticks bite the deer mice and ticks then bite human beings, so they pick it up from the deer mice. So there was a question of putting in a gene drive on this island, which would then be a great experimental controlled area because it wouldn't go off the island, presumably, hopefully. And they could give these mice immunity to the bacteria through a gene drive, as I was just describing. Ultimately, they decided not to do that. And what they did is they had another alternative, which was to make mice immune, but they're not passing it on. They could inject them and they could make them immune, but they're not passing it on to their offspring. I think that it was interesting because the community got together and talked about it. So we have some tools that are just profound in what they can do, particularly gene drives.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's scary too. It can do amazing things. Can you imagine a world without malaria? Now, the other thing is we don't know fully what would happen if we made these mosquitoes extinct. We don't know what it would do to the whole sort of environmental cosmos.
Yeah.
So there's just so many questions this raises, but unlike nuclear weapons, it's much more democratic. Many, many, many more people have access to it.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
So there's just so many questions this raises, but unlike nuclear weapons, it's much more democratic. Many, many, many more people have access to it.
Do you maintain your medical license?
You know, I was just thinking about that with the COVID problem. So I think mine expired because you have to do CME courses, and I just didn't have time. Though now I teach a lot of courses, so I probably could. So it expired in 2016 or 17. But I imagine if things get really bad, they would probably grandfather us back in or something.
Right.
I'm really good at starting IVs.
You're good at starting IVs? I'm not. I like to go through both sides of the vein and then back up and try again.
God, yeah, no, that's not a good thing. But being a pediatrician, we have to do it with neonates and preemies, and that's a super challenge. So you learn really all the tricks and how to do it.
Yeah. We had Krista Vernoff on the show a while back, and she was an executive producer for Grey's Anatomy. And it's interesting how, you're a doctor, so you obviously come with, a pedigree of knowledge and a capability. And it's interesting how someone like Krista can come up, and her main skill set, which is formidable, is that she's a fantastic drama writer. She's desperate to be a comedian and a singer, but what she is this drama writer. When did you realize that you needed to do this? And then when you broke the news to your mom and you're like, hey, Mom, you remember that medical degree that I went to Harvard to get? Never mind all that.
Well, I was a writer before I went to medical school. So I did China Beach and the after school special. So I knew I loved telling stories. Medical school gave me just a treasure trove of stories. And I'm the first, along with Lance Gentile, who was the other doctor on the show, I'm the first doctor writer in television. Actually, I was a fourth year medical student when I started on ER. So I'm definitely the first medical student writer. But now every medical series, Krista was doing Grey's. Zoanne Clack is and still is, I think, the doctor on the show. We set a new standard, as did David Kelly, being really the first lawyer writer for LA Law. And so we brought this verisimilitude to the show, and we brought in our own stories, which people love. They love the reality. Before ER, the last big medical series was St. Elsewhere, and before that there was, Medical Center and Marcus Welby and Dr. Kildare, et cetera. They all, Ben Casey, relied on people to sprinkle the medicine and consultants after the show was written. And that's why it was always about really the personal life of the patient, obviously, because couldn't really get enmeshed and immersed into the medicine. When I came on ER, John Wells, the showrunner, wanted, and Michael Crichton was a trained physician, wanted, the perspective of doctors, and didn't want to do it from the perspective necessarily of the patient. And he didn't care if people understood all the medical talk, and he wanted it to look real. So we had ER docs alternating each episode. One did odds and one did evens to make it look real and teach Noah and Eric, George, Tony, Sherry, Juliana, Laura, Gloria, how to make it look real, and so on, prosthetics and all of that stuff. And Eric took it so seriously and was always practicing because he was a surgeon on the show. And Eric LaSalle really learned how to tie. When I was doing my residency and someone said, oh, that the best you can do for suturing? It's like Noah Wiley could do better. And I thought, yeah, we taught him how. It's so funny. So we brought a new veracity to to a television show about medicine, and we drew on our own lives. And that's now the case with my friend David Foster. I went to medical school with. I helped him get on House. So he was the doctor on House. I had given him his first jobs on SVU as a freelancer. So he's now on New Amsterdam. And so every show, David did House all the years it was on. Every medical series has doctors on it now. And we set that standard. And I think the audience demands it. And it's not just like sort of the private life of a patient who happens to be in a hospital. And in order to do that, you have to have physician writers. And so I love telling stories. And medicine is really about gathering stories. It's about being a detective. When you go and talk to a patient, you have to discern their history and figure out what's relevant, what's not, and not piss them off so that they tell you the truth. And you've got to put all of the data together and come up with a narrative that makes sense, lest you go down the wrong road and make the wrong decision. And boy, we did that many times on ER, So it's just a natural place for one to tell compelling stories about literally what is most engaging, life and death.
Let's go back and talk a little bit about Designated Survivor and how CRISPR is used in that show. It's available on Netflix for those that want to watch it. And also talk a little bit about, you can make something that, look, every show is impossible to make in Hollywood. It's just super tough to get things done. But then something like COVID-19 breaks out, and all of a sudden your show that was like, it's in the competition, it's standing up on its own merits. But now, holy cow.
Right. Well, I feel we've been doing that for years. We would laugh about SVU and say that, the mothership Law and Order was ripped from the headlines. And we would say that the headlines ripped from us. We did so much research. So for instance, the story about opening the backlog of rape kits that Mariska's taken on, and she did a documentary. It started because I met a woman who was afraid to leave her apartment. She'd been sexually assaulted, and she learned that her kit had not been tested. So it obviously made sense to me and everybody else on the show that there were people out there who could be apprehended because they probably committed crimes and they were in jail. So we had their DNA and they were out committing these crimes. And why weren't we testing these kits? And it's because we just didn't care. Really, we didn't have the political will. And so Mariska's taken that on as her, mission, which has been really, really important. And she's accomplished a lot and can, testifying before Congress. But we started with an episode with maybe, I can't remember, in the mid 2000s, I think, with Jennifer Love Hewitt as the guest star, playing that person who inspired the story. And we did research and we found out that there were hundreds of thousands of untested kits. And so we felt that we had to start it somewhere. And we did, it's taken years, but Mariska has really been in the forefront of opening the backlog of rape kits. And it starts with a story. So we did stories about rape in the military that didn't get much attention, rape on college campuses. And then Kirby Dick's documentaries really came and ran with it. But you need to lay the foundation. And so I think we've been laying foundation for years about these stories. And it started with Gloria Rubin's character on ER playing Jeannie Boulet, who was HIV positive, in a time when there was a lot of fear, like now, and mystery about HIV. And she played the first ongoing character who didn't die from HIV. It's because when we did this storyline, coincidentally and fortunately, antiretrovirals came about. So we were able to take her story down for many years. And then she came back at the end of ER and showed that she was still a vibrant, healthy person. So this role modeling that we do and showing these stories, I think, has a huge impact. And maybe not at first, and you have to accrue a number of stories, but we're very fortunate that we've been able to start the ball rolling. And so I feel like with CRISPR, we've started the ball rolling, and now there are going to be many more shows. There are documentaries now out about CRISPR, but we were, I believe, the first drama to really deal with it. And it was, it just takes the efforts of many storytellers. One story isn't enough.
how many stories is enough? Like, when do you reach that critical mass where, you and another show, and all of a sudden there's a documentary, and, like as someone who does podcasts, COVID-19 is something. So now I'm finding people that can talk intelligently about it. When does that critical mass reach? Because SVU's been around forever now. It's not a struggling show anymore, Neal.
21 years, and it's just been renewed for 3 more. But that's because it taps, I think there are a number of reasons for SVU's success. One is, of course, Mariska, who represents the, she's there for the victims. And when Maloney was there for 12 years, he was the anger we feel, and Mariska was the yin and the yang, and she was the compassion and empathy. So they fit well together. And she continues that. And it's something that wasn't talked about, and now it is talked about. And it has that, uncertainty, edge of your seat, who did it kind of thing that people like. It's settled at the end of each episode. There's like a catharsis. The bad guys are caught for the most part. And we learn a lot. And it's also like a way to talk about many, many, many different subjects that we did, because you're just meeting people through the city and they have all these different issues. So it was kind of this ideal show. And also, I think young women keep discovering the show, and Mariska's a tremendous role model for them. So I can't tell you how many times I've been at events or things where people say they watch it, or they watch it in hotels, or they watch it on planes or whatever. And then they'll say, oh, and my daughter just discovered it. It's like, yes, I'm glad. And so Mariska's a role model for young women. And there's always, fortunately, more young women growing up, watching the show. They watch old shows. I think ER is the same. I read that it's, a huge hit on Hulu amongst millennials. And the great thing about ER is that everybody's in scrubs, and everybody still wears scrubs that look exactly the same. So it could be pretty much the same show now as it was 25 years ago. ER still look pretty much the same. And, we made it a little more high tech as we went on, but, scrubs haven't changed. And so ER kind of is timeless.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why people it raises the same questions about life and death, and who should decide, and who gets the resources and who doesn't, and should medical care be available to everyone, and all the things we struggle with daily and yearly. Those shows really grappled with, and those are things that move people and people care about. So I think that's what keeps shows like SVU going.
What are your thoughts on, as we get older as a population, we're finding new things to conquer, and we don't die from our 3 alcohol or 3 martini lunches and smoking habit at 52 years old anymore. We keep going. So now we have these new end of life problems that we're slowly solving.
We die from opioids,
or we have a lot more. Parkinson's is growing because we just live longer. We can age into that category. So do you think, talking about your boy with the cystic fibrosis who chooses, like, I'm done, and beyond a DNR, how about like if I reach this point with my Parkinson's, with my ALS, with my whatever those debilitating diseases are, where you lose the ability to have any sense of life. When grandpa is swirling the drain for 6 months.
Right. Well, that's where we spend the most money at end of life. That's also another storyline turns out on Designated Survivor, with Italia Ricci's character dealing with her mother who has end-stage cancer, who wants to be euthanized. And euthanasia, she lives in Florida, and she decides to move up to DC because her daughter is going to not work in the campaign and take care of her mother. And she says, no, I'll come to DC. Little does Italia's character know that euthanasia is legal in DC. So let me just counter that by saying that there is a problem that costs us hundreds of billions of dollars. And that is, when I graduated from medical school in 1996, 15% of American adults were obese. And now 40% are obese and 30% are overweight. So 70% of our population is at very high risk for type 2 diabetes. In the last figures from about 2017, we spend over $300 billion a year, between 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 healthcare dollars, treating type 2 diabetes or what it causes: heart disease, retinal disease, kidney disease, neuropathy. So we spend this huge amount of money on something that's preventable. So we haven't learned yet, even though we're growing older and healthier in some ways, we're actually less healthy and much more overweight than we ever were. And so that's what we're spending the money on now. And we could do something about it if we choose to.
Yeah, when we talk about medical care for all, all the groups have to do some kind of sacrifice. We all need to take better care of ourselves so that we're not consuming mass amounts of medical care. I found out an interesting stat the other day that 8,000 residencies, there are more doctors than there are residencies in the US. And then if you don't get a residency in a certain amount of time, the window closes on that doctor's career. And I think the number is 8,000 doctors with degrees who graduate. Now, granted, maybe they come from less prestigious places, but they don't even have a shot at getting out there. Maybe that was their path. That's another issue where if everybody had medical care, and I'm not against medical care for all at all. I'm just saying that there is a logistics problem of hospitals, doctors, orderlies, all down the line.
Yeah, no, it's that's called the match. And if you just look at the number of African American men who are in medical school, the number is infinitesimal compared to everybody else. So that's a societal problem that has roots in education, access, all kinds of things. So there's much that we can do. And I think COVID reveals, besides our not being prepared, with kits and the like, that we have to think through in a much more compassionate way how to provide medical care and I think this is going to help people, I hope, think about how they protect not only themselves and their families, but each other. So maybe there'll be a watershed moment that we're approaching where we will change from our sort of more inward selfness to a more selflessness.
Yeah, maybe. What do you see in the future? Like, what's coming up in terms of sexy, exciting stories? You've had your finger on the pulse, or however you get your finger in front of the pulse of society, and telling all these wonderful, wonderful stories in SVU, telling all of these tragic stories that have been kind of hidden. What do you see out there? What interests you beyond COVID and CRISPR?
Beyond CRISPR, because CRISPR really occupies me for the most part now. So I think, to me, there are 4 areas of concern for humanity: nuclear annihilation, global warming, artificial intelligence, and weaponized drones, and CRISPR. So I think doing stories about those areas interest me the most. And that's why I took on Designated, because we did a storyline about opioid abuse with Tony Edwards and Lauren Holly's character, and the way that the FDA approved the drugs. We were able to really get into a lot of different issues besides just the CRISPR issue, making, for instance, insulin has gotten much more expensive. And we were the first show, I believe, to integrate documentary footage in the drama. So Keifer's character as the president wants to know what the people are thinking. So one of our characters, played by Ben Watson, goes out and gets real documentary footage of non-actors. And one was a woman whose son died, he was 27 or so, of type 1 diabetes, which is treated with insulin. And he had no insurance. He made $35,000 a year or so he didn't qualify for Medicaid. He worked, though, and he was too old to be on his parents' insurance. And so he rationed his insulin and died. So a lot of people are going to Canada to buy insulin in what are called insulin caravans. So we were able to interview real people, real meaning non-actors, and get their stories, and it's very compelling. So that interests me, how to do some hybrid shows that integrate documentary. I just worked, I'm the executive producer of a documentary that will be on HBO in June, and it won a special jury award at Sundance, and it won the Berlin Film Festival Best Documentary Award, and it's called Welcome to Chechnya, and it's about the sanctioned murder of gays and lesbians by the president of Chechnya. And it's an astoundingly compelling film directed by David France. I hope people will watch it. They can go on the website, welcometochechnya.com, and learn about it. Unfortunately, now with COVID, the festival circuit has been closed, but the film will air soon. And I think it's really worth seeing that these kinds of travesties can still occur. So that's what pulls me to do these stories. And I was drawn to that story.
Yeah, there's no end to these human stories where people are put against impossible odds and completely unfair situations. Just like the whole thing with the rape kits. Here's all this evidence sitting there and it's not used. And then now we're looking at, the killer that we caught. What was that guy's name? He had so many different names. The Golden State Killer. All of the names.
We were the first to do it. I read a piece years ago that why do we have to have a 99% match? This was like a journal article. What if we had a 50% match? So early on, Mariska swabs her cheek and sends it through and lies and says it's a perp because she wants to know if she can find her father, who was a rapist. And she ends up finding her brother, who'd been in prison. And that's how she finds her father. So she went from a 99% match, which is what we were always doing, to a 50% match. And that's how we caught the Grim Sleeper, because now we do not a 99% match, and we look at, and there was just a new cold case that was just uncovered where they sent through like Ancestry or those places, the old DNA, and they found like cousins. And then they made a family tree and they saw, okay, this person lived in this area, and that's how they got the person. And then they found his DNA and they matched it, and it turned out that was a 99% match, but he wasn't in the system. So, and then there are, of course, civil liberties questions about doing this kind of work.
Right.
But that's what SVU did. And so we were the first to do that. Nobody had thought of doing that kind of story before.
That's incredible, man. Good for you guys for doing that too. That stuff is, it's just, it gives that DA or that detective that one thing like, hey, I saw this episode of Designated Survivor. What if it's this, and you really can, like you said. What did you say? You guys didn't rip the story straight off the front page.
They ripped them from us. Yes, they ripped them from us. Yes, exactly.
I appreciate it. Well, listen, man, I appreciate you coming on and talking. It's fascinating to hear all of this stuff. And obviously you're an authority on TV shows, but turns out you're also an authority on medicine. And I appreciate you sharing this stuff, because it's all part of that big pile of information that we've got to create to get the thing nudged over the top. And if you didn't do it, who would, So thank you.
Sure. I'm really glad I was able to come on, and it's been I feel really grateful and fortunate that I've been able to have the bully pulpit to tell these stories. So thanks a lot.
Now, where anybody who wants to follow up with Neal, I'll put all the information in the show notes, breakitdownshow.com. Everything will be in there. Links to the Netflix special, Welcome to Chechnya. I'll put all that stuff in the show notes. There's so much stuff. It's massive. Neal, thank you again for coming on.
Sure. Thank you. Nice to see you.